Hello and welcome to this special broadcast for EWTN, the Eternal Word Television Network, on John Henry Newman. My name is Father James Bradley. I'm a priest of the personal Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham, currently serving as a parish priest in Southampton on the south coast of England. And I'm here in the college in Littlemore with my good friend, Dr. Stephen Morgan. Stephen is an expert in John Henry Newman and will be here for a conversation today about the life of Newman, about his importance in the life of the church today, and also something of a historical overview of Newman's life and importance. It's very good to see you and very good to have you here.
Thank you, Father.
Would you like to just tell our viewers, first of all, a little bit about yourself, your own background and your academic interests and your current work?
Yes, of course. I'm a deacon of the diocese of Portsmouth in southern England, but at the moment I work as Dean of the Faculty of Religious Studies at the University of St. Joseph in Macau in southeast China, not far from Hong Kong, a former Portuguese colony, and a place in that part of the world that Newman coined the expression Far East to describe. We might come back to that later. I'm married to Caroline and I have 3 almost entirely grown-up children, finishing university and launching out into the world at the moment.
And your interest in Newman, where does that come from and how does it manifest itself?
Quite a long time ago now, 30 years ago, I was a student for the priesthood, and I was a student for the priesthood in Birmingham, where Newman lived for most of the second half of his life. And I became aware through the places that I visited as a seminarian, including the chapel in which Newman received the sacrament of confirmation, of the significance of this man. His concerns and his intellectual heritage became quite important to me in my studies. Some years later, I came here to Oxford to undertake a doctoral degree. In Oxford, it's bizarrely called a DPhil rather than a PhD, but it's the same kind of thing. And I worked there on Newman's theology, and specifically his theology of development. And it's a subject that I return to, I regularly teach.
You mentioned the University of Oxford there, and before I said that we're here in the college at Littlemore, I wonder if we might just start by saying something about the importance of Littlemore as a place, and perhaps to explain to our viewers why in fact we're here at all.
Yes, of course. We're here in Littlemore because this place, in fact this very room in which we're speaking, is a place in which an event took place in Newman's life which was pivotal. It occurred almost exactly halfway through his life. It occurred here on the 9th of October 1845, and it's the place in which he became a Catholic. He was received into the church, as we would now call it. He made his first confession, he made his submission to the Holy See, and he received communion for the first time in this room at the hands of Dominic Barbary, a Passionist priest, now, like Newman at the moment, a blessed, who was an Italian who had conceived the idea as a young man of coming to England to preach Catholicism. So Newman is received into the church here. Why is he here? Well, for 20 years, almost 20 years, Newman had been vicar of the University Church in Oxford, and Littlemore was part of that parish. As his relationship with the Church of England cooled and distanced in the early 1840s, he acquired this place, which was largely a rather run-down set of stable buildings, and turned it into a place of retreat where he and other Oxford undergraduates and fellows who were considering their future in the church could come and think and consider their future. So that's why we're in Littlemore, why we're on the outskirts of Oxford, a place that Newman had spent 20 years in by the time he was received into the church.
And in talking about Littlemore and in talking about that very intense period of Newman's life, perhaps it's also a good idea for some of our viewers who may not be as familiar with the person of John Henry Newman to maybe talk about his early life and what led him to the point of his arrival in this place.
That's a very interesting story to tell. Newman was born in 1801, in February 1801, and grew up in a pious Anglican household. He described the religion that he grew up in as a religion of reading the Bible and praying. In his teens, in 1816, his family have a crisis. His father is a banker, and the bank has a serious financial downturn following the end of the wars against France and an agricultural depression. And Newman gets very ill in the summer of 1816, and he has what he later calls his first conversion. That is, he comes to believe, as he puts it, in two and two only luminously self-evident beings, myself and God. And he also says that at that moment he received into his intellect impressions of dogma, which by the grace of God, thankfully, have never been effaced. And we might return to the significance of that later. He's a bright boy and comes up to Oxford and enters Trinity College in 1817 to study Literae Humaniores, the study of the Greek and Latin classics, philosophy and literature, the only subject, in fact, which you could study as an undergraduate in those days. He works terribly hard, and in fact overworks, and experiences what we might call a burnout just before his final examinations, in which he doesn't do terribly well. But everybody in the university knows that he's a very bright young man, and he is asked to enter a competition to join the faculty of one of the colleges. They're called Fellows of the college, and the university college that he is invited to compete for admission to as a fellow was a college called Oriel College, which at the time was probably the most academically prestigious of the colleges in the university. And he is elected a Fellow of Oriel in 1822. And he stays as a Fellow of Oriel from 1822 until several days before his conversion in 1845. As a member of the faculty, he teaches. As a tutor, as the college tutor, he sees himself as having a moral responsibility for the education, not just simply the intellectual education, but the whole human formation of the men, and it was only men, the men in the college. But at the same time, he is a man like most fellows of Oxford colleges at the time, who becomes a clergyman in the Church of England. He's ordained in the Church of England as an Anglican presbyter in 1825 and becomes vicar of the University Church, the Church of St Mary the Virgin, which belonged to Oriel College. And with the office of vicar of St Mary the Virgin comes responsibility for this place, for Littlemore. A place, the responsibility for which he takes terribly seriously. He says that it is, at the time, little more than a few rundown hovels. It's about 3 miles from Oxford. It's all built up now, but in the 1820s and 1830s, that meant it was the best part of an hour's journey from Oxford. It's a small agricultural community in those days, and Newman does various things there. He builds a church to replace a virtually derelict medieval building, and perhaps more importantly, he builds a school.
And I think that one of the things that perhaps is helpful to think about is the context in which Newman's working in these early years of his life. He's born, as you rightly said, at the beginning of the 19th century, a time of great upheaval in many respects, but also great advances. You think of the Industrial Revolution and the advent of technology. How would you situate Newman in Victorian society, not as in the sense of society as in the people he was with, but how does he sit as someone born at the beginning of one century, moving into a very new and exciting century?
I think that's an area of Newman's life that we perhaps don't think about hard enough. It's worth remembering that he's already 36 years old when Queen Victoria comes to the throne. He's a Georgian. He's born in the reign of George III, the king who lost the American colonies. He lives through the Napoleonic Wars. He says he has a childhood memory of candles being lit in the windows to celebrate the victory at Trafalgar, right at the beginning of that century. He dies in 1890, aged 89. Almost exactly as I said earlier, half his life spent as Anglican, half of it spent as a Catholic. When Newman is at Oxford, Oxford is a university that really achieves two things. It educates clergy for the Church of England, and it acts as a finishing school for the middle and upper classes. When he dies in 1890, Oxford is one of dozens of educational establishments in England training a new professional middle class, although it took Oxford and Cambridge perhaps slightly longer than anywhere else to catch up with the demands of that. Another thing that happens in that period, though, is the great Romantic awakening. The 18th century had been a time of Enlightenment values, the kind of Hellenizing Greek values. You think of buildings built in the 18th century that look back to the buildings of Greece. By the time of Newman's death in 1890, for example, people have rediscovered architecture from the Middle Ages. They've discovered the affective rather than just the rational. And Newman, I think, in many respects, is a man who holds together the rational nature of Christian faith, the rational nature of human existence, with the need for the affective. Mm-hmm. And that's a very important thing to hold together at a time when technology is advancing very quickly. We think of technology advancing very, very quickly now, but I think perhaps it might be worth reflecting upon the fact that when Newman was here in 1840, to get to your parish in Southampton would have required a stagecoach journey of 16 hours. By the time Newman dies in 1890, the journey from Oxford to Southampton can be done on the train in only about 20 minutes longer than it now takes. Yes. Maybe 2.5 hours.
And that whole sort of rediscovery, as you said, of the medieval, of Romanticism, I wonder, we know that when Newman was at the University Church, he began to meet with other academics in the city of Oxford who were thinking about the nature of the Church of England and what the Church of England is, how it came about, what its origins are. And that's really, I think, the beginning of this sort of opening up for Newman of a trajectory towards the Catholic Church, institutionally at least, perhaps. Perhaps we could just talk briefly about Newman and his sort of coterie of friends. We called it the Oxford movement. Perhaps say something about that as well.
Yes, of course. The origins of the Oxford movement are, which was a movement in the Church of England that is largely seen as having concentrated in Oxford, although there were parallel movements in Cambridge, and the individuals concerned all kind of knew one another. There was a feel that the religion of England was cold, that it spoke in a manner that was more over-rational, or in a manner that was high and dry, was one of the expressions that was used. Now, there had been a kind of evangelical awakening in the Church of England, and in some respects, Newman's early years were very heavily influenced by that, but he was very suspicious of that. He was suspicious of it because he sensed that it was all about feelings and not about impressions of dogma, which is a kind of a very reasonable, a very rational approach. And amongst his friends were individuals like Edward Pusey and, of an earlier generation, John Keble, who recognised that there was an English history of religion that stretched back. In those days, certainly they were looking back to the arrival of St. Augustine at the end of the 7th century in England. And they recognised that the churches of England had stood through that period that predated the Protestant Reformation. And that got them asking questions about where they might look. Keble writes a very, very important devotional book called The Christian Year, which looks back at some of those dates in the Church's calendar which had been virtually obscured in the Protestant liturgy of the Church of England. And Keble writes about them in order to awaken people's hearts. The 1830s, we tend not to spend very much time looking at the history of the 1830s now, but it's worth saying that it was a time of great social strain and stress across Europe. There'd been a revolution in Paris in 1830, and one of the things that gave rise to was a kind of conservative backlash against rationalism. And here in Oxford, that appealed. Oxford has often been called the home of lost causes. It was the university that stayed loyal to Charles I until the very end. It was the university that was most associated with bringing the monarchy back in England after Cromwell. There's something perhaps in the warm stone of Oxford that retains these things. At least Newman thought so, and so did many of his friends. So following these revolutions in 1830, there was a movement in England in the air. But there were triggers, and one of the triggers for Newman was associated with the state's control of the church. In 1828, 1829, the Prime Minister of England, then a man called the Duke of Wellington, who'd beaten Napoleon at Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington managed to get legislation through Parliament to allow Catholics to come to the universities, although the universities took quite a long time to get their heads around that. And the Catholic Church took even longer, but it removed the civil disabilities of Catholics in England. It allowed them to stand for Parliament. It allowed them to serve in the military with a commission. It allowed them to take a full role in most respects in civil society. The MP for the university, in those days Oxford and Cambridge sent MPs to university. The MP for the university was a man called Peel, William Peel, who went on to become a Conservative Prime Minister of England in the 1840s. And Newman felt that by allowing Catholics a full role in civil life, Peel had betrayed the Constitution of England. And the answer to that came from Newman's political heritage and political friends was that this was the job of the state. The state had the right to do things like this. That made Newman and his friends quite uncomfortable, and the by-election around Peel's re-election was very, very uncomfortable. 3 years later, the government of England introduced a bill that interfered in the organisation of the church, the Anglican Church in Ireland. And it involved the suppression of dioceses and the confiscation of revenues. And Newman was away on holiday with friends in the Mediterranean during the latter part of 1832 and early 1833. And he'd arranged for his colleague, John Keble, to preach a sermon at the university church in the summer of 1833. Keble's sermon came to be known as National Apostasy, and many see it as a starting gun of the Oxford movement. And what it was seeking to say was that the Church of England should not be a creature of the state. The state had certain rights in respect of the church in order to guarantee its status as a national church, but that didn't mean undermining the authority of the church. Now, between 1833 and 1841, that movement produced all manner of things. It produced hymns, many of which we still sing, hymns like Firmly I Believe and Truly. It produced poetry. Newman and his friends felt that it was very important to create an imaginative landscape, a landscape that appealed not just to the intellect but to the imagination, that it spoke to the heart as well as to the head. They called this ethos. Ethos. In your background within the Ordinariate, you might call that patrimony. Patrimony. They understood that Christianity needed to be configured in such a way that wasn't simply raw emotion, which would have been their criticism of some of the evangelical approaches, but much more than simply rational, cold, paper logic.
And that whole movement really also brought about a revival in sort of neo-medieval architecture and an interest in music and all those sorts of things. That whole, I suppose it's seen as sort of Victorian Romanticism, but in a sense it was an intellectual pursuit as well for people like Newman. And that understanding of the Church of England, that understanding of the Christian life and its integration into the life of the state that Newman sort of and his friends developed, as it were, around this time was something that led Newman to ask certain questions later on in his life. And it's been a joy today to spend time with you, speaking heart to heart about someone that's very dear to both of us, to understand more about the life of John Henry Newman and to share that with others. Deacon Stephen Morgan, thank you so much for spending this time with us here in the college at Littlemore.
Father Bradley, thank you.